My father, Richard, had always made it clear that my older brother, Jake, was the one who mattered most to him, and I learned that lesson long before I was old enough to understand what it truly meant. From the moment we were kids, Jake was given everything: new bikes, expensive sneakers, private coaching for whatever sport he wanted to try, and later, a brand new car the moment he turned 16, while I had to save up for a used junker that broke down every other month. It wasn't even about the money, though that was the most obvious way he showed his favoritism. It was about the way he looked at Jake, like he was proud of him before he even did anything worth being proud of, while I had to constantly prove that I was worth a second glance. By the time we were both adults, the pattern had been set in stone, and it wasn't going to change. When Jake decided he wanted to start a business, my father barely let him finish his sentence before pulling out his checkbook and writing a number so large I actually felt my stomach turn. I had never seen my father give anyone money like that, not even my mother before she left him years ago, and certainly not me. "It's an investment," he said proudly, slapping Jake on the back as if he had already built a multi-million-dollar empire with nothing but his charm and good intentions. "This is how you build something real, son. A man needs to take risks." A few months later, when I gathered my courage and asked for help with my college tuition, I barely got a response. My father actually laughed, shaking his head like I had just told the funniest joke he had ever heard. "Emma, you're smart," he said, his voice filled with a kind of condescension that made my skin crawl. "Figure it out." That was all he gave me. No check, no support, not even an ounce of concern for how I was supposed to figure it out while juggling 2 part-time jobs just to scrape by. I wanted to be angry, and part of me was, but mostly, I just felt exhausted. I had spent years trying to earn even a fraction of the attention and respect Jake got effortlessly, but the truth was, it had never been a fair fight. My father didn't see me as someone worth investing in, because in his mind, I would never be as valuable as his son. It didn't matter that I had better grades than Jake ever did, that I worked harder than him in every possible way, or that I had ambitions that didn't involve coasting by on someone else's generosity. All that mattered was that I wasn't Jake, and that meant I was on my own. So I figured it out just like he told me to. I took the jobs that nobody else wanted, working late into the night while balancing coursework and pretending I wasn't drowning in stress and exhaustion. I watched Jake post pictures from expensive business dinners and trips to Vegas, living large with money that wasn't his, playing the role of a successful entrepreneur while I was barely scraping by. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I didn't want to be like Jake, relying on our father for every opportunity, pretending I had built something when really, it had been handed to me on a silver platter. But the resentment still simmered beneath the surface, growing stronger with every passing year.
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I told myself I wasn't keeping track, but of course I was. Then one night, everything shifted. I had come home for a rare visit, mostly out of obligation rather than any real desire to see my father, when I overheard something that made my blood run cold. I had been walking past his study when I heard him on the phone, his voice filled with pride, talking about Jake's company, like it was his own. I wasn't planning to eavesdrop, but something in his tone made me pause, my fingers tightening around the railing as I listened. "You don't understand," he was saying, chuckling like he was explaining something obvious to an idiot. "I didn't just help him out. I built that business. Every dime came from me. If it weren't for me, that company wouldn't even exist." I stood there, frozen, the words echoing in my mind as the realization set in. He hadn't just helped Jake get started. He had fully funded everything, pouring money into the business like it was his second child, while I had been left to struggle alone. He could have helped me, and it wouldn't have hurt him in the slightest. He could have written one check, just like he had done for Jake, and my life would have been different. But he hadn't because he didn't want to. He had made his choice, and it had never been me. I walked away that night without saying a word, my hands shaking with something that felt dangerously close to hatred. But I didn't scream and I didn't cry. Instead, I made a silent promise to myself, one that would take years to fulfill. I was going to figure it out, and one day, I would make him regret every last decision he ever made. Figuring it out turned into my daily routine, an exhausting cycle of working, studying, and barely keeping my head above water, while the world around me seemed determined to remind me of everything I didn't have. I would wake up before sunrise, drag myself to one of my many jobs, then rush to class, my body running on caffeine and whatever cheap meal I could afford that day, knowing that no one was coming to save me if I failed. The bitterness in my chest never really faded, but I forced myself to push it down, to swallow it like medicine, to turn it into something useful instead of letting it consume me the way it wanted to. Meanwhile, Jake strutted through life as if nothing could ever touch him, basking in the warmth of our father's endless support and financial backing, his so-called business thriving not because of his brilliance, but because he had been handed every possible advantage before he even had to ask for it. He lived in a high-rise apartment that he didn't have to pay for, drove a car that cost more than my entire college education, and made reckless investments that should have destroyed him, yet somehow, he always walked away unscathed. I watched from the sidelines as he threw money at ideas that made no sense, hiring people based on whether he liked drinking with them rather than whether they were competent, throwing lavish parties under the guise of networking, and expanding his company too fast without any real structure in place. It was a disaster waiting to happen, but no one dared to tell him that, least of all our father, who still spoke about him as if he were a visionary rather than a spoiled man-child burning through cash he had never earned. I, on the other hand, learned how to build without permission, how to create opportunities where none existed, how to navigate a world that had already decided I wasn't worth investing in. I worked my way into finance, not because I loved numbers, but because I wanted to understand how money worked, how power was gained, how control was taken. I learned how to read balance sheets like they were stories, how to predict failure before it happened, how to recognize the cracks in a seemingly unshakable foundation. I watched people who thought they were untouchable lose everything overnight, and I told myself that one day, I would be the one holding the cards instead of the one begging for a seat at the table. The resentment that had fueled me for years didn't disappear, but it evolved, sharpening into something more dangerous, more focused, more patient. I stopped looking at my father's rejection as a wound and started seeing it as a lesson, a reminder that I was never going to be given what I deserved, so I would have to take it instead. Then one night, I stumbled upon something that made my pulse quicken with something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. It was late, and I was sitting in my tiny apartment, scrolling through financial reports out of habit more than anything else, when I saw it, a small article buried beneath 100 others, a few lines of text that sent a shiver down my spine. Jake's company, the golden child of my father's investments, the business that had been treated like the crown jewel of our family, was in trouble. The numbers didn't lie, even if Jake and my father refused to acknowledge them. His reckless expansion had left him stretched too thin, his cash flow wasn't covering his expenses, and his debts were starting to catch up with him in ways that even our father's money couldn't fix. Investors were getting nervous, suppliers were demanding faster payments, and there were whispers, quiet, but growing louder, that he wasn't nearly as competent as he pretended to be. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding harder than it should have, my fingers tightening around the edge of my desk as a slow, dark smile spread across my lips. I had spent my whole life watching them act as if they were untouchable, as if their wealth and power made them immune to consequences, as if they would always be the ones holding control while I was left to fend for myself. But nothing lasted forever, and for the first time in my life, I realized something that changed everything. I didn't just have to figure it out. I could take it. Have you ever been overlooked in your family, pushed aside in favor of someone else, made to feel like you didn't matter no matter how hard you worked? Have you ever dreamed of the moment when you could finally turn the tables, when you could make them see what they ignored for so long? Because standing there, staring at the proof that Jake wasn't invincible, I knew that moment was coming, and I wasn't going to waste it. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing with possibilities, my pulse steady with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. Jake was in trouble, and for the first time in my life, I was ready to win. The day I received my first real paycheck from my high-paying job in investment banking, I sat in my small, sparsely furnished apartment and stared at the numbers on the screen for a long time, feeling something strange settle in my chest, something that I'd been missing for years. It wasn't pride, and it wasn't even relief, because I had known from the beginning that I would get here eventually. It was something colder, something sharper, something that made my fingers tighten around my phone as I thought about all the times my father had dismissed me, all the times he had made me feel like I would never amount to anything without his approval, all the times he had thrown money at Jake, as if he were investing in a legacy rather than a spoiled man-child who didn't know how to manage anything without a safety net beneath him. I had spent years clawing my way up, learning everything I could about finance, about investments, about power, about how to recognize weakness in people who thought they were invincible. I had lived on scraps, working more hours than I slept, saving aggressively while my coworkers spent their bonuses on cars and vacations, forcing myself to remember that this wasn't just about money, it was about positioning myself for something bigger. Every dollar I earned was a step closer to something that had been brewing in my mind ever since the night I overheard my father admit that Jake's company wasn't built by Jake at all, but by him. Meanwhile, Jake continued running his business the same way he always had, recklessly, impulsively, without any real understanding of how money actually worked, convinced that as long as he carried himself with confidence, things would magically fix themselves. He made deals that didn't make sense, partnered with people who were only interested in draining as much cash from him as possible, expanded into markets he didn't understand, and ignored every warning sign that should have made him stop and reassess. But, of course, none of it mattered, because our father was always there, ready to swoop in with another check whenever things got too messy, ready to clean up his mistakes before they could become real consequences, ready to reassure him that failure wasn't something he needed to worry about because, in his world, it simply didn't exist. But failure was coming for him whether he wanted to acknowledge it or not, and I was going to make sure of it. It started small, just a few shares here and there, nothing that would raise suspicion, nothing that would make anyone look too closely at the names on the paperwork. I had spent years learning the game, understanding how ownership was structured, how power could be gained in increments so small that no one noticed until it was too late. I set up dummy corporations, separate accounts, quiet investments that blended in with the rest of the noise, knowing that as long as I was patient, as long as I moved carefully, I could get exactly what I wanted without them ever realizing what was happening. Every time my father bailed Jake out, I smiled to myself, because all he was doing was pouring more money into a sinking ship, refusing to admit that his golden child wasn't the genius he had always pretended to be. And the best part was, Jake never saw it coming. Never even questioned why people were still willing to buy shares of his company despite its obvious financial instability. He had convinced himself that he was untouchable, that nothing could ever truly go wrong for him, that failure was something that happened to other people, never to him. Then one night I saw it. A small article, buried beneath bigger headlines, nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just a quiet warning sign that most people would skim over without a second thought. But I wasn't most people, and when I read the words, my pulse quickened, my fingers tightening around my phone as a slow smile curled at the edges of my lips. Industry analysts were beginning to speculate about whether Jake's business could survive the next year, whispering about mounting debts, about declining investor confidence, about the real possibility of bankruptcy. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, my mind racing with possibilities, my heart steady with the knowledge that everything was finally falling into place. Jake was about to lose everything, and I was going to be the one to take it from him. There was something strangely satisfying about watching everything slowly unravel, knowing that no matter how hard Jake or my father tried to hold it together, the cracks were spreading faster than they could patch them. I had spent so many years waiting for this moment, moving pieces into place without ever letting them realize there was a game being played at all. And now, standing on the outside looking in, I could see the inevitable collapse inching closer with every bad decision they made. Jake's company had always been a fragile thing, held together not by intelligence or skill but by arrogance and blind faith in the idea that as long as my father was willing to pour money into it, it would never fail. But now, the money wasn't enough. The reckless expansion, the bad investments, the careless hiring decisions, the mounting debts, everything was converging into a perfect storm of disaster, and for the first time in his life, Jake was beginning to realize that he wasn't invincible. Our father, however, was still fighting against reality, refusing to accept that his golden child had run the business into the ground, blaming everyone but the person actually responsible. He ranted about disloyal investors, about banks that didn't understand Jake's vision, about an economy that was supposedly working against them, about anything and everything except the truth, that his son had been given every opportunity to succeed and had still managed to fail spectacularly. He spent hours on the phone trying to find a solution, calling in favors, looking for new capital, desperately trying to keep the business afloat despite the fact that it was already drowning. I could have ended it right then, could have watched them flail and panic until there was nothing left but ashes, but I wanted more than that. Letting Jake fail on his own wasn't enough. I needed to be the one who took everything from him, to watch the realization dawn on his face when he understood that the person he had always dismissed as insignificant had been the one pulling the strings all along. So I made my move, stepping in quietly, strategically, without drawing attention, making offers through intermediaries, working through third parties, ensuring that no one connected the dots until it was far too late. The company was desperate for cash, scrambling for any lifeline, and I provided it. Not as myself, but as a faceless investor offering a way out. Jake, of course, took the bait without hesitation, seeing nothing but the opportunity to keep his sinking ship afloat for just a little longer. He signed over shares, piece by piece, without questioning where the money was coming from, too arrogant to believe that anyone could ever outmaneuver him, too blind to realize that the very thing saving him was also taking control right out from under him. By the time the dust settled, I was the majority shareholder. The moment I walked into that boardroom, everything changed. Jake was already seated at the head of the long glass table, his sleeves rolled up like he had been working tirelessly to fix the mess he had created, though I knew better than anyone that he was probably just hungover from another night of avoiding his problems. He glanced up when I entered, expecting to see another nameless investor, another suit trying to tell him how to run his own company, but the second he recognized me, his expression shifted into something between confusion and disbelief. My father, sitting beside him with tired eyes and graying hair that he had once kept perfectly groomed, but now let go unkempt in his growing frustration, was slower to react. He didn't look at me right away, too busy skimming some useless report that wouldn't change the inevitable, but when he finally lifted his gaze and saw me standing there, his entire body went rigid. For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. Then I smiled, slow and deliberate, savoring the moment as I pulled out a chair and took my seat at the table. "Surprised to see me?" I asked, letting my voice carry just enough amusement to twist the knife even deeper. Jake looked between me and our father, his confusion turning to something darker, something dangerously close to fear. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharper than I had ever heard it before, filled with an edge of uncertainty that told me he already knew. On some level, even if he didn't want to admit it, he knew exactly why I was sitting there. I folded my hands in front of me, tilting my head slightly as I met his glare without so much as a flicker of hesitation. "I own the company now," I said, letting every word sink in before delivering the final blow. "You work for me." The silence in the boardroom stretched longer than I expected, thick with the weight of disbelief and something dangerously close to panic, though neither Jake nor my father would dare to say it out loud just yet. Jake's hands were clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white against his skin, his breathing uneven as if his brain was still struggling to process the reality of the situation. My father, usually so full of bluster and self-righteous authority, just sat there with his mouth slightly open, his expression unreadable, his aging face lined with something I had never seen before: powerlessness. Jake was the first to break, slamming his palm against the polished wood so hard that the sound echoed through the room, making a few of the board members flinch. "This is a joke," he spat, his voice filled with disbelief, his eyes burning with fury as he leaned forward as if trying to intimidate me into backing down. "There's no way in hell you pulled this off on your own." I met his gaze without hesitation, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch, letting my silence stretch long enough that I could see the first flickers of real fear creep into his expression. "You weren't paying attention, Jake," I said finally, keeping my tone calm, controlled, almost amused, because I knew it would enrage him even more. You never do. His nostrils flared, his jaw tightening as he turned toward our father, looking for support, for reassurance, for anything that might make this nightmare disappear. Dad, tell her she can't do this, he said, his voice rising, his composure slipping further by the second. This is my company. I built this. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head slowly, savoring the moment as I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in front of me with deliberate ease. You built nothing, I said, my voice cutting through his rant like a blade, making him freeze mid-sentence. Every dollar that kept this company running came from Dad. Every bad decision you made was covered by someone else. Every time you should have failed, someone swooped in to save you. I tilted my head slightly, letting my smile widen just enough to twist the knife even deeper. But not this time. Jake stared at me as if he had never really seen me before, his breathing heavy, his face red with anger, and something that looked an awful lot like panic. You can't just take everything from me, he said, his voice shaking now, his bravado crumbling beneath the weight of reality. I slid the contract across the table, watching as his eyes darted to the thick stack of papers, his fingers twitching like he wanted to shove them away, but knew, deep down, that there was no way out of this. You'll sign the agreement, I said, my voice as steady as ever, leaving no room for argument. You'll walk away with nothing, because that's exactly what you deserve. His head snapped toward our father again, desperation creeping into his expression now, his arrogance cracking apart in real time. Dad, do something, he begged, his voice raw with disbelief, as if he had never once considered the possibility that there wouldn't always be a way to fix his mistakes. You can't let her do this to me. My father finally exhaled slowly, his hands resting heavily on the table as he stared at the contract in front of Jake, his eyes scanning the words, taking in the undeniable truth of the situation before looking at me with something that almost resembled regret. Emma, he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual authority, carrying something closer to exhaustion. You've made your point. You don't have to do this. I lifted an eyebrow, tilting my head slightly as I studied him, letting his words settle in the air between us before replying. You always told me I was smart, I said, my voice quiet but firm, deliberate in every syllable. So, I figured it out. Something flickered in his eyes then, something that looked dangerously close to shame, but I didn't give him the chance to speak again. Instead, I turned back to Jake, nodding toward the contract with a small, patient smile. Sign it. For a long moment, I thought he might refuse, that he might throw some last-ditch tantrum, might even try to fight this in court despite the fact that he had no case, no leverage, no power left at all. But then, slowly, with hands that were no longer steady, he reached for the pen, his fingers trembling as he signed his name at the bottom of the page, the final act of surrender in a battle he hadn't even realized he was losing until it was far too late. When it was done, I picked up the contract, flipping through the pages to make sure everything was in order, the weight of victory settling deep into my bones as I stood from my chair. Goodbye, Jake, I said, my voice light, almost dismissive, as I turned toward the door without another glance in his direction. But just as I reached the exit, my father spoke again, his voice carrying something colder now, something heavier, something that made me pause just for a moment. You think you've won, he said quietly, his tone void of the exhaustion from earlier, replaced by something sharper, something dangerous. But this isn't over. I turned my head just enough to look at him over my shoulder, my lips curling into the faintest smile, meeting his gaze without an ounce of fear. We'll see about that. The moment I took full control, I knew I wasn't going to simply let things rest, because winning wasn't enough. Not yet. Not when there was still so much left to take. Not when there was still a lifetime of being overlooked and dismissed that hadn't yet been repaid in full. Owning the company was only the first step, the opening move in a game that I had been preparing for years. But now that the board was set in my favor, I had no intention of stopping until there was nothing left of what my father had built. Nothing left for him to salvage. Nothing left for Jake to cling to in the ruins of what had once been handed to him so freely. So I did what they had never expected, what they had never once considered a possibility, what would have been unthinkable to them in a world where they had always been the ones holding the power. I didn't save the company. I didn't rebuild it. I didn't nurture it into something better than what Jake had turned it into. I tore it apart, piece by piece, selling off key assets, breaking it down into parts that would no longer resemble anything my father had once poured his money and his pride into. It started with the smaller divisions first, the ones Jake had expanded into without understanding, the ones that were already hemorrhaging money and clinging to life out of sheer stubbornness rather than profitability. I made deals quickly, quietly, cutting losses without hesitation, stripping away the excess weight that had been dragging the business down. Then I went for the bigger pieces, the headquarters building that had once been a symbol of success but had long since become an empty monument to my father's arrogance, the research and development wing that had never produced anything groundbreaking because Jake had never cared to hire the right people, the subsidiaries that had been acquired out of greed rather than strategy. Each sale was a nail in the coffin, each signature on a contract another step toward the inevitable end, each press release another reminder to the world that the empire my father had built and handed to his son was no longer something worth saving. And through it all, I watched as Jake unraveled, as the weight of his own failure finally crashed down on him, as he spiraled further into the realization that there was no one left to bail him out, no one left to fix the mistakes that had always been covered up for him. At first, he tried to fight it, tried to convince himself that this was all temporary, that he could still find a way to turn things around, that there had to be some last-minute miracle that would make everything go back to the way it had always been. He ranted in the press, telling reporters that the company was being mismanaged, that I was making irrational decisions, that I was too blinded by revenge to see the bigger picture. But no one listened, because the numbers didn't lie, and no matter how much he tried to spin the story, everyone could see the truth now. Jake had never been capable of running a business, and the only reason it had lasted as long as it had was because our father had never let him face the consequences of his own incompetence. When the headlines stopped favoring him, and the investors stopped taking his calls, he turned his frustration toward our father, blaming him for everything, accusing him of choosing the wrong person, of backing the wrong child, of ruining his life by never forcing him to learn how to stand on his own. He wasn't entirely wrong, but the irony of it made me laugh more than it made me pity him, because he had spent his whole life believing he was untouchable, only to realize too late that he had never been anything more than a puppet dancing on strings he hadn't even known existed. And as Jake fell apart, my father finally broke. The man who had once carried himself with the unwavering confidence of someone who believed he could shape the world to his will now looked smaller, weaker, as if the weight of his own choices had finally caught up to him. His money was disappearing faster than he could stop it, his name no longer carried the same influence it once had, and the company he had once treated like a second son was now nothing more than scattered pieces in a game he had lost before he even realized he was playing. Then, finally, when he had exhausted every other option, when there was no one left to turn to, no favors left to call in, no strategies left to salvage what little remained of his legacy, he did the one thing I had been waiting for. He came to me. It was late when he arrived at my office, long after everyone else had left for the night, long after I had expected him to hold out before swallowing his pride, but there he was, standing in the doorway, his shoulders heavy with something that looked like resignation, something I had never seen on his face before. He didn't speak right away, didn't launch into another speech about how I was making a mistake, didn't try to wield whatever authority he still thought he had over me. He just looked at me for a long time, his eyes scanning my face as if searching for something familiar, as if trying to understand how the daughter he had once dismissed had become the person sitting in front of him now. Then, finally, with a voice that was quieter than I had ever heard it before, he said, "Emma, we need to talk." I leaned back in my chair, studying him carefully, letting the silence stretch between us, letting him feel the weight of his own desperation before I responded. Then, slowly, deliberately, I let a small smile curve at the edges of my lips as I reached for my phone and tapped out a message, my voice light when I finally spoke. "Dinner tomorrow night," I said, watching as his expression flickered with something uncertain, something wary, something he couldn't quite place. "I'll send you the details." And as he nodded reluctantly before turning to leave, I watched him go, knowing that he had no idea what was coming next. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. The restaurant was one my father had taken clients to for years, a place where deals were made over overpriced steak and glasses of wine that cost more than most people's rent, a place where he had once walked in with the kind of confidence that came from knowing he was the most important man in the room. I had chosen it deliberately, knowing that every detail of the setting would remind him of everything he had lost, of how far he had fallen, of how he no longer belonged in places like this. He arrived exactly on time, dressed in a suit that no longer fit as well as it once had, his posture still trying to hold on to the authority he had spent his life wielding, though there was something in his eyes now that hadn't been there before, uncertainty, hesitation, the quiet understanding that he was no longer in control of this conversation. I watched as he walked through the dining room, past tables filled with men who had once answered his calls without question, past faces that barely registered his presence now, past waiters who had once rushed to serve him but now regarded him with polite indifference. He saw it too. I could tell, though he didn't acknowledge it, didn't let his expression change, didn't let himself falter as he reached my table and sat across from me without a word. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, heavy with all the things that had led to this moment, all the choices he had made, all the things he had done and not done, all the years of dismissal and favoritism and quiet cruelty disguised as indifference. Finally, he cleared his throat, his fingers tightening around the edges of the menu as if it might offer him something he could hold on to. "Emma," he said, his voice steady, measured, as if he still believed he could control the direction of this conversation. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." I tilted my head slightly, watching him carefully, waiting to see how he would play this, how he would frame his request, how much pride he was still holding on to despite everything. I was curious, I admitted, my tone light, almost amused, though the sharpness beneath it was unmistakable. "You don't usually ask for meetings unless you're the one with something to offer." A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance, frustration, a reminder that he had spent his life as the one calling the shots and was now sitting across from the daughter he had ignored, forced to treat her as his equal, or worse, his superior. He exhaled slowly, setting the menu down, his fingers tapping once against the table before he spoke again. "I made mistakes," he said carefully, the words clearly rehearsed, the tone measured, as if he was testing how much I was willing to believe. "I should have treated you differently. I should have supported you the way I supported Jake. I see that now." I let the words sit between us for a moment, studying him, weighing the sincerity behind them, wondering if he even knew what a real apology was, or if this was just another calculated move, another attempt to regain control of a situation that had long since slipped from his grasp. "That's interesting," I said finally, picking up my wine glass, swirling the liquid slowly before taking a sip. "But I don't remember asking for an apology." His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't take the bait, didn't rise to the challenge, instead forcing his expression back into something carefully neutral. "Emma," he said again, this time softer, as if he thought appealing to emotion might work where logic had failed. "I need your help." I smiled then, slow and deliberate, setting my glass down as I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, letting him see exactly how much I was enjoying this moment. "Of course you do," I said, keeping my voice light, almost sympathetic, as if I truly felt sorry for him instead of relishing every second of watching him squirm. "What exactly do you need from me, Dad?" The word hung between us, heavy with meaning, a reminder of the title he had never truly earned, of the years he had spent making it clear that his son was his only real concern, of the way he had dismissed me without a second thought when I had needed him most. He hesitated, just for a second, but I saw it. The way his shoulders tensed, the way his fingers twitched against the tablecloth, the way he swallowed just a little too hard before forcing himself to speak. "I need a job," he admitted, the words clearly painful, the humiliation barely masked behind his forced composure. "Something stable. Something that will help me get back on my feet." I nodded slowly, pretending to consider, though I had already made up my mind long before he ever sat down. "I think I can arrange something," I said after a moment, letting my voice carry the kind of kindness that wasn't kindness at all. There's an opening at one of the smaller divisions, entry level, of course, but it's a start. It won't pay much, but you'll have a steady paycheck, and you'll get to see firsthand how real work is done. His entire body stiffened, his face paling slightly as he realized exactly what I was offering him, as the full weight of the humiliation settled onto his shoulders, as he saw the future I was handing him, a future where he was no longer the one giving orders, no longer the one with power, no longer the man he had spent his life believing himself to be. "You're joking," he said, though the lack of conviction in his voice told me he already knew I wasn't. I raised an eyebrow, tilting my head slightly. "I thought you needed stability," I said, my tone smooth, even unwavering. "That's what I'm offering." He stared at me, his expression unreadable, his hands tightening into fists against the tablecloth, his entire body radiating tension as he fought against the reality of his own situation. Then, slowly, he exhaled, pushing his chair back as he stood, his movement stiff, his composure cracking at the edges. "I don't need your pity," he said, his voice low, rough, filled with something dangerously close to desperation. I leaned back in my chair, watching him, unbothered, unimpressed, unaffected. "Then figure it out," I said, throwing his own words back at him with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. He turned without another word, walking out of the restaurant with his back stiff, his shoulders squared, his pride still clinging to him like a weight he refused to set down. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The moment my father walked out of the restaurant, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never see him the same way again, because in that instant, he was no longer the man who had towered over me my entire life, no longer the authority figure whose approval I had once foolishly chased, no longer the invincible force who had shaped my world with nothing more than his unchecked arrogance. He was just a man, fragile and breakable, struggling to hold onto something that had already slipped through his fingers, walking away with nothing but his own pride weighing him down like an anchor, refusing to accept the simple, undeniable truth that the world had moved on without him. For a while, I didn't think about him, because there was nothing left to think about, nothing left to feel, nothing left unresolved except for the fact that I had won in every way that mattered. The company was gone, the money had dried up, and Jake had vanished from public life entirely, retreating into obscurity after realizing that no one wanted to hear from a failed businessman who had once coasted by on the generosity of others. I had taken everything they had used against me, everything they had once valued, everything they had once believed would always be theirs, and I had left them with nothing but the consequences of their own decisions. It should have been the end of it, but then, months later, I heard something that made me pause, something that sent a small ripple of amusement through me, something that confirmed what I had already suspected all along. My father had tried to rebuild. It wasn't surprising, really, because a man like Richard Monroe would never be able to accept defeat, would never be able to sit still and let the world forget him, would never be able to admit that he had lost to the very daughter he had once dismissed without a second thought. He had found investors, or at least tried to, promising them that he still had the knowledge, the experience, the vision, insisting that his past success had been more than just luck, that he was still the man who could turn a business into an empire. But no one believed him anymore. Every connection he had once relied on had either turned their back on him or no longer saw any value in aligning themselves with someone whose name had become synonymous with failure. The people who had once answered his calls without hesitation now ignored him entirely. The friends who had once clung to him like shadows had disappeared the moment his influence had vanished. The reputation he had once built for himself had crumbled beyond repair. No one trusted him, no one wanted to invest in him, and no one cared enough to offer him the second chance he had never given to anyone else. I didn't reach out to him when I heard the news, didn't gloat, didn't offer some final cutting remark, because there was no need. The silence was enough. Months passed, seasons changed, and life moved forward without him, without Jake, without any trace of the empire they had once treated as untouchable. I flourished, my investments grew, my success multiplied, and the name Monroe became something else entirely, no longer a legacy tied to my father, no longer something that carried the weight of his history, no longer something I had to fight against just to be seen. Then, one evening, as I stood at a rooftop party surrounded by people who now spoke my name with admiration rather than dismissal, someone turned to me with a curious expression, their voice laced with something I couldn't quite place, as they asked the question I had been waiting for, the question that had lingered at the edges of every conversation, the question that people whispered about when they thought I wasn't listening. Do you ever feel guilty? For a moment, I let the words hang between us, let the question settle into the space around me, let it breathe, let it exist, because I wanted to see how it felt, wanted to see if there was even a shred of doubt buried somewhere deep beneath everything I had built. But when I finally spoke, when I finally let my lips curve into a slow, deliberate smile, the answer came as easily as breathing, as natural as the air around me, as unshakable as the foundation I had spent years constructing. I just did what my dad told me, I said, lifting my glass in a quiet, private toast to a past that no longer held any power over me. I figured it out, and with that, I turned away, stepping forward into a future that was finally, truly, undeniably mine.